Hey, everybody, and welcome back. Today, I'm just going to give you a brief kind of overview of my parents for those who might find some of that interesting. My dad, Mark, was the youngest of three children from Durham, North Carolina. His oldest sister, Catherine, my aunt, and Pansy was his the other older sister. Catherine had two children, Kathy and Stuart, who are my cousins, obviously. Pansy had Mary, Martha, and Jimmy, little Jimmy. I don't really see many of them. Kathy had a son, Jeff. I've met him a few times. The only person really in all of those that I know and knew well was my cousin Stuart and my aunt Catherine. My mother and Catherine loved each other. They were like two peas in a pod. Catherine was a pistol. I just adored her. And Stuart has been so good to me over all the years. We've known each other since I graduated from college, and there's nothing I can say to repay Stuart or do for all the things he's ever done for me. So, just love him to death. And we still talk often as we can, still to this day, even though he lives in lovely California and travels the world as a lovely government employee. So, as far as heritage is concerned, we tried the whole, DNA stuff and the, watch your family tree, whatever. But there were so many ways that that family went. It was almost impossible to link anything together that went anywhere specific or deep back in time. So we were never really successful with that. My father would always make allegations, that he had made this connection or that connection, whatever. But when my wife started to look at it in depth and started to do it, she was unable to really verify those connections in her mind. So I don't really have that much to say. I know my dad would have loved to have, had all sorts of great stories to tell about his family history, but at this point, I just don't have any to say. I can say that my father, were it not for the GI Bill, would have never gone to college. He ended up getting into the war late. He joined the Navy, became a Navy photographer, and was stationed out of Hawaii. So he basically, photographed, giving medals and this thing and that thing. He was never involved in any real combat of any kind, and he just basically kind of made his way through the tail end of the war as best he could, and was glad to have done so. But at any rate, that got him into college, and he ended up doing radio, and spent his early, time out of college doing radio. He was a great on-air voice, had a wonderful, voice for radio, and he was extremely good at improv. He could improv his way out of a wet paper bag with no problem. He was great at it. So he was a natural, and he ended up spending his career through what you would call the golden age of radio and TV. He went from radio and then went into television. He ended up putting the very first TV station on the air here in Central Florida, the CBS affiliate. And from there, he went on he was the production manager there. Then he went on to start one of the very first advertising and public relations companies in in Central Florida, which he ended up running until the day he died. Actually, it was something he did for the rest of his life. So that was where my father was, and he was a good old Southern gentleman. That's how he always envisioned himself. He tried all that, Southern etiquette and, politeness and all that kind of stuff. But, in the end, we can say with honesty that there was a certain level of bigotry that ran through my father. And that was ugly. And in the end, he ended up basically going down the far right rabbit holes and really lost his way, I think, and that became very difficult as well because you spend your life in that business. You should be able to see BS when it comes in front of you. But he just got to a point where he just would ignore it. and accept it as truth. And that really hurt. That was hard for me to get over with him. But he divorced my mother right after they had their 20th anniversary party. Great timing, right? And ended up marrying his secretary. So, classic story, right? I don't know if it was, secretary, copywriter, whatever. She worked for him. And, but she was a wonderful woman. I liked her, never really had that big of a problem with her. She was sweet, and that was okay. You do what you're going to do. I never held it against him or anything, and they would later have a child of their own. And, that was the way that went. But so I ended up having my father at one end of town and me and my mother at the other. Now, my mother, on the other hand, she was the only child born in Sebring, Florida. Her parents were from Moultrie, Georgia, was where her mother was from. Her father was an interesting story because her father and his brothers were basically made orphans. The original father and mother, the mother died. We don't really know how. We can't find anything that really says how. But the father remarried. But then the father died. And again, we can't really find out how. But he did. And when he died, the second wife just vanished. Just left the kids, didn't want anything to do with them. Just basically took off. So it must have been a pretty hard time for them at that point. So the oldest son, we lost all track of him. Couldn't trace him at all. But the two brothers, of which my grandfather was one, actually were taken to live with one of the uncles of the mother. And this is the odd part, because as it turned out, way, way down the road, when my mother was living, here in lovely Central Florida, she was part of a bridge club, and one of her best friends in this bridge club just happened to be from a family that we ended up figuring out was the family that had given a home and fostered her grandfather, her father, which was amazing. How those came together was just amazing. That her grandparents had fostered my mother's father, during all those years, and now here they were. They had no clue. They played bridge together, they hung out together, they partied together, and then when they figured that out, it was just like, wow, how amazing is life when you really get right down to it. But we can say from my mother's side, she, her lineage goes way, way back. We can trace it all the way back to Geoffrey Chaucer, as a matter of fact. And Geoffrey Chaucer is my direct great, how many great grandfather. I am a direct descendant, as is my brother, of Geoffrey Chaucer, which is kind of a bizarre sort of a thing. Not that that's worth a nickel, but, it is what it is. My mother, of course, had she known that when she were alive, would have just been over the moon with that, because she was an English major, and, that just would have made her day. Excuse me. My mother also played clarinet, so she sang, so she wanted to be in any glee club and little orchestras and all that. She was a stage mom, loved to do stuff, which is how she ended up meeting my father, because they were doing, all sorts of these little, skits and playthings, and theater stuff while my dad was in college and so forth. And my mother just loved, everything about the theater. She loved ballet. She loved classical music, orchestras, chamber music, you name it, she loved it. If it was theater, it was my mother. And, my mother was pretty much a bull in a china shop. So this was where her and my dad, I think, probably fell apart, because once my brother and I were old enough where my mother didn't have to be there all the time, she wanted to do something, so she went out and got a job. And, my dad, being the Southern guy he was, you're not supposed to have a job. Well, she did. And then she made a decision without him to, take in our foster brother. And my dad had no choice in that. And I think that kind of riled him up pretty bad, too. He didn't really go for that too much. And my mother pretty much, got into her mode of, this is what you're going to do, and I'm telling you this, and so therefore you're going to do it. If you don't do it, you're an idiot, because I know what to tell, I know what to do, and you're going to do what I tell you to do. My mother was, my way or the highway kind of girl, and she would not hesitate to tell anybody what she thought they were doing wrong and how to fix it. But I can't. I mean, my mother and I, my father and I, relationship was distant. Because he became a distant father. He was there to some degree at points, but not at others. He kind of disappeared. And my mother, she went through an angry period. Angry at the world, angry at my dad for divorcing her and all that stuff before she settled back down. And I had a push-pull with my mother. We both knew how to push our buttons. She could rile me up, I could rile her up. But then again, we could also have the most fun together you could ever imagine. So, I was there for my mom at the end of her life to help her through all the issues and problems she faced, and I'm grateful that that's the case. I learned a lot about her, about me, about everything else. And I'm glad that I was there, that fate made sure I was here to be able to deal with all of that and go through that. I remember my grandmother. I have very little memory of my grandfather. He died when I was very young. But my grandmother, she was a pistol. They ran a little five and dime, and he sold china and stuff down there in Sebring. So they did pretty well for themselves. And they had kind of a little side bank going. When my grandmother passed away and we were going through everything, I found her ledger book. And she would make loans to people all through town, and she would collect interest. And she would stay on top of you to get paid. It wasn't like, don't worry about it, that's okay. Oh, no. She made her money. And, of course, in the same note, there were the notations of the bigotry, that was present. It was, polite and hidden, kind of covered up, but it was there, which, I guess from that period, these are all people that grew up in the South, kind of hard. My mother, she worked her butt off for all sorts of, communities of color and disadvantaged communities throughout her life. But I still think in the very end, there was still a small element of that built-in bias in her, because whenever she had, and she always had, once my dad divorced her, she always had a housekeeper that would come by a couple times a week. And that was always a black woman. I don't know why, but it always was. And that was just something that struck me, that, that's the way it was supposed to be. Blacks serve the whites. I don't know. But I can get into more detail down the road with my parents. But they were, like I said, both college educated. The nice thing was they were not religious people. They were not political people. So I was free to grow up in an environment where I had none of that thrust upon me as a child and burned into my head that I had to overcome or contend with as I grew older. I was free to experiment and learn about all that stuff myself. So I thank them both for that. That was a really, really a great thing for them. So as far as the rest of my mother's family, I really never really met many of them. So we haven't kept touch, and I wouldn't know where to find them today. But that's kind of the size of it. So if you found that interesting, hopefully it will serve you some purpose. Otherwise, you can always check with my wife. She's got far more details on all the ancestry stuff to take you through. So let's call it a day on that. That's enough about my parents. You're going to learn more about them as we go through other videos. So in any case, let's move on from here. Thanks, everybody. Peace. And as always, hang 10.